talks, and the first talk will be delivered by Michael Rosenberg and Yu Liu.
Cool. Hi, I'm Michael Rosenberg. Today I'm presenting joint work with Julia Hesse and with another group of Yo Liu and Shengli Liu. Funnily enough, this other group completely independently came up with exactly the same constructions as us, like identical, and also very similar theorems to us. So I'm happy to be presenting all together. Yo is going to be joining me for the conclusion and Q&A section. So we have a combiner on password authenticated key exchange. So let's go through what password authenticated key exchange is. In this setting, we have two parties who have mutual knowledge of a low entropy secret, i.e. a password. And this password can be, quite bad. And they use this knowledge, mutual knowledge of a password, to derive a shared high entropy key. This has two security properties that we care about, namely that a passive adversary that observes this interaction essentially has no advantage at determining the final key, and that an active adversary who participates in this session can guess the password, but only has one password guess per session. So we are going to build a PAKE combiner that is an algorithm which takes two underlying PAKEs and puts them together to derive a new PAKE with some combined properties of some sort. And I'll also note, and I've said this before, that this is a very weird setting. We have a setting where we have two parties with low entropy shared secrets. There's no PKI, there's no authenticated channels, there are no encrypted channels, and yet we're able to say something cryptographic about this setting. PAKEs are very weird, and it will influence how we go about our constructions. So we start with the problem of we have classical PAKEs, and we have post-quantum PAKEs. And what we would like to do is simply use post-quantum PAKEs if we can. However, this comes with a few issues. Firstly, these are relatively new, so maybe we don't trust the assumptions, although some of the assumptions are maybe relatively old comparatively. However, we also have new constructions themselves, right? These new PAKEs that rely on these new assumptions themselves are relatively new and in fact have had bugs, which we'll see in the next talk. And also the implementations are relatively new, and new code tends to be buggy code. So these are some of the bugs that you'll see next. So one solution is to hedge with hybrid constructions. That is, build a construction that uses classical assumptions as well as post-quantum assumptions. And this is a typical way of going about things that is recommended by various governments. So our problem statement is, how do you build a hybrid PAKE? So we present two constructions, a parallel combiner that we call parcom. This runs two PAKEs in parallel and then outputs the final key. And then sequential combiner, or seccom, which runs the first PAKE, then a second PAKE, and then outputs the key. And so these have hybrid guarantees. That is, it gives you the best of both worlds of classical and post-quantum security. They're cheap. They only cost 2 hash functions. And because of generic constructions, if you get a PAKE, a hybrid PAKE, you can also get a hybrid APAKE, and you can also get a hybrid IPAKE. APAKE being augmented PAKE, and IPAKE is identity binding PAKE. Okay, so let's see how to build it. And to see how to build it, we'll first see how not to build it. So a chem combiner is maybe the most common kind of combiner, something that we all know about. You just run the two chems and then hash together the results, right? So what happens if you run two PAKEs in parallel and then hash the results together? So let's start with a PAKE. This one is called EEK, and we'll add key confirmation to it, and we'll see what this means. EEK is essentially unauthenticated Diffie-Hellman, just plain Diffie-Hellman, but instead of sending the regular key shares, you encrypt the key shares under the password. So concretely, you're sampling a Diffie-Hellman key share, you encrypt under the password. This encryption is a keyed permutation function. Doesn't matter that much. You send it over, and then you derive the shared secret, Again, this is just Diffie-Hellman. We'll also add key confirmation, which is just a MAC tag. And so we'll have the responder send this tag tau, that is the MAC over the shared secret. And the initiator will verify. So our second PAKE will essentially be the same thing. We'll make this chem-based just so we have a thing that's plausibly post-quantum. This is essentially the same structure, except we're using a chem instead of Diffie-Hellman, but it's essentially the same thing. OK, what goes wrong here? Oh, also, we hash the key at the very end. What goes wrong here? Well, this tau, this MAC, reveals something about the password, right? If the discrete logarithm problem happens to be broken, then an attacker who simply sees the transcript can go back, guess a password, perform a discrete log, compute the tag tau, and then compare it to the tau that they observe in the transcript. And so any attacker who has a discrete logarithm oracle can effectively guess and check the password by simply observing this transcript. And similarly, if the chem is sufficiently broken, an attacker can do the same thing. So this hybrid construction is actually the weaker of the two underlying constructions. It is the exact opposite of what we want from a secure combiner. OK, so let's try again. We're going to use cake, which was on the previous screen, and we'll try again to make a hybrid PAKE. So cake is chem-based, so why not just plug in a hybrid chem? So if you recall, a hybrid chem has a public key that is the concatenation of the two underlying public keys. And so this encryption of public keys will be the encryption under the password of the two underlying public keys. We already have a problem here, because suppose the first public key is an LWE sample, right? Then an attacker, if LWE were broken, if they had an LWE oracle, an attacker could simply guess a password, see if what they get for PK1, or the encrypted PK1, is an LWE sample, and then know with pretty high confidence if their password guess was correct or not. So again, you have a passive attack that's only as secure as LWE. This is not what we want from a combiner. OK, so how do we do better? So let's go back to EEC. So I'll note here that it seems like the only actual problem with this construction was the tau, right? This is what allowed the guess and check attack. So let's remove it. What happens now? Well, I'll argue that the transcript is now completely uniform. So we're sampling this small r here, and we have a Diffie-Hellman key share, and we're encrypting it. And so this r prime is going to be uniform. And this s prime similarly is going to be uniform. And in particular, these are uniform values that are statistically independent from the password, right? Because they are simply encrypted Diffie-Hellman key shares, and the key shares themselves are uniform, and the encryption is a keyed permutation. So this is a very special property. We call this statistical password hiding. It is statistically independent from the password. And this is actually a property that many of the elliptic curve-based PAKEs already have. EEC has it, SPAKE2 has it, and CPACE has it. So let's try to build the parallel combiner again, but we will require this very specific property of statistical password hiding. So in this case, we'll require that PAKE1 and PAKE2 both have this property. And in the case that PAKE1 is broken, we can assume, let's just say it's as broken can be, and K1 is going to be 0. Right? In this case, the transcript, even if it's broken, is still uniform, because again, it's statistically uniform. And also this K2 is still secure, because we're assuming that PAKE2 is secure and that only PAKE1 is broken. And in this case, the shared secret is going to be secure because we're hashing in that K2. So this combiner is still secure, and by symmetric argument, when PAKE2 is broken, we get the same result. So this actually works for a combiner. So more concretely, and I'll leave some of this to the conclusion, but we prove this in the UC model that if either one of these achieves the PAKE functionality, then the parallel combiner achieves PAKE functionality. So EEC satisfies this. Unfortunately, we don't have any post-quantum constructions that achieve the PAKE functionality and are also one round in statistically password hiding. So we have some weakenings of this that permit slightly weaker constructions. So this one is called lazy extraction pake, and we show that you get a similar result for that. And this opens it up to other kinds of pakes like SPAKE2 and CPACE, which are more standardized. And we also show that there is an isogeny group action-based pake that achieves bare lazy extraction pake functionality. And so you actually can instantiate this with a classical and a post-quantum construction. I will note, though, that this is the only such instantiation. This isogeny group action one is the only such one that fits into this slot. And so we wonder, can you make something that has more options? And also, can you make something that is a little bit more efficient than something that uses isogeny-based group actions, which are something like 300 to 400 times the cost of like an encapsulation in MLChem? So the answer is yes, and we'll construct this with a sequential combiner. So in a sequential combiner, we simply run these pakes one after the other. We'll put in the password, we'll get a key, we'll put in the key into the second one, and we'll get a final key. This doesn't work as stated. Oh yeah, and we'll hash the keys together. This doesn't work as stated because the first pake can simply have the same MAC problem. You can just permit guess and check. So we'll require that the first pake is statistically password hiding as we did before. Okay. This still doesn't work because what happens when pake 1 is broken? Well, if pake 1 is broken, we can assume K1 is going to be 0, so you feed it in to pake 2, and these are predictable values, right? And so the output of pake 2 may well also be predictable. And so the final hash is a hash of entirely predictable values, and it's not going to be a secure final key. However, this is pretty close to a solution because all this requires is us to feed more values into the second pake, something less predictable. So let's add that. So instead of just feeding K1, we're going to compute a value Z, which hashes in the password, K1, and the transcript of everything that's happened so far. And we're going to feed that into pake 2. Okay, so what happens when pake 1 is broken? Well, let's say K1 is 0. This Z is still going to be sufficiently secure because it has a hash of the password in it. And so you're going to be feeding Z into the second pake, and you will get a final shared secret that is still secure. Okay. And what happens in the other case when pake 2 is broken and pake 1 is secure? Then your K1 is going to be secure, and so your final K is still going to be fine, right? There is one small thing that has to be corrected, though, which is if pake 2 is so broken as to leak the values of the Z that are inputted to it, it can leak whether the Z's are equal. Now, if the Z's are equal, that means that pake 1 succeeded, right? And if the Z's are unequal, that means that pake 1 failed, right? This is a very kind of small thing to leak, but leaking the success of a pake is still a leakage, and so we have to prevent that from happening. And so the way around this is you simply require that pake 2 not have that property. So in particular, you say that it is statistical pre-shared key equality hiding, or statistical PSK equality hiding. That is to say, if Z is sufficiently high entropy, even if pake 2 is completely broken, it still doesn't leak the equality of its two inputs. And in fact, this is a property that's shared by EECPRF and CAKE, which are both post-quantum pakes. And it's also a strictly weaker property than password hiding, statistical password hiding. And so all of the aforementioned classical pakes have this property naturally. So we prove some specific properties of the sequential combiner. Again, this is in the universal composability model. If either one of these achieves fpake, then the sequential combiner achieves fpake. We also have a relaxation of this, so you can use lazy extraction pakes. Also, if you simply change the setting a little bit, you can remove the statistical PSK equality hiding entirely. That is, if you just say that adversaries will never make pake 1 fail, then you don't have to consider the case where pake 1 fails, right? There's no leakage anymore. So you can make this disappear, and it doesn't necessarily get you the full universal composability theorem, but it is a nice relaxation of this. Also, this is analyzed in the QROM. And for the conclusion, I'll give it to Yo.
Now I will give a conclusion. So, so we gave the first construction of hybrid packs, and we presented two methods: a parallel combiner and a sequential combiner. And the sequential combiner only requires mild assumptions. It works with efficient existing packs like CPs, SPEC2, and EKE-based lattice packs. And here is a summary of our results. If both pack 1 and pack 2 has password hiding property, then the hybrid pack from our parallel combiner achieves the user security only when only required any one of the two pack achieves the user security. And if pack 1 has password hiding property and pack 2 has PSK equality hiding property, and any of them achieves the user security, and so then the hybrid pack from sequential combiner achieves user security too. And furthermore, if the pack 2 has user security in quantum random walk model, then the hybrid pack from our sequential combiner also achieves user security in QRAM, but it achieves a little bit weaker functionality than the standard pack functionality if the pack 2 has no a PSK equality hiding. It will additionally leak 1 bit to the adversary and to tell the adversary whether the two parties use the same password in the pack execution. So the community is interested in our work, and they are considering to make a hybrid pack to be an IETF standard. And for more technical details, you can refer to a full version of our papers. Yeah, thank you.
We have time for a couple questions. Yeah, please come.
Thanks for the nice talk. I was wondering, you gave this counterexample when the public key is an LWE sample. That problem you still have, right? You still have to exclude this because you would not have statistical password hiding if this is there.
Yeah, yes. So if in the EKE, if the password is, let me think. The public key is a LWE sample. So if the LWE is not hard, the adversary can, for example, try the password and to decrypt the encryption and check whether it's a LWE sample.
So even if I remove the tag, I still have to.
Yeah, that's right. So PAKE 1 has to be something where you don't have LWE samples as public keys. So PAKE 1 has to be like EEX, PAKE 2, or CPACE.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about the, conditions to apply the equality hiding property? So wouldn't Z in particular have low entropy if it's the hash of low entropy password?
Do you want to?
Sorry. Yeah. So you mean the PSK equality hiding property? Yeah. So if the pack 2 is broken, and then we need so the pack requires if to hide the whether the pack is success or not. So if they use the different passwords, so the adversary cannot judge whether they are equal or not. So if the pack 2 is broken, we must rely on some statistical properties to ensure this. So this is the motivation of the PSK equality property. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Is there some fundamental reason why the parallel construction was not proven in the QROM?
Yeah. So I think in the parallel combiner, you need to do some reprogrammable, I think. So yeah, and you also may need some extractions. So I think this is one problem. And in the sequential combiner, this case is easy to, it's easy to deal with, I think. Yeah. So the program, I think the main problem is reprogramming. Yeah.
Yeah, just like a quick one. Yeah.
Just a quick construction. It seemed to me that you said that the problem with it is that you have this kind of cross attacks, right? So have you looked into, I mean, this is from Michael, I guess. Have you looked into what happens if you essentially double the length of the password and just use one for each side? Are there other attacks with that?
If you use an independent password on both sides?
Yeah.
I've given this some amount of thought. I think it's fine, right? If you're fully willing to allow one password to be completely compromised, for example, and keep the other password secure, if that's within the threat model, then fine. So for example, if you have a PAKE that uses an ephemeral key, you get a 6-digit PIN, and now you turn it into a 12-digit PIN because you want to do 2 PAKEs in parallel, then yeah, fine.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's thank the speakers again. Yes, so the next talk will be delivered by Jake Giannozzane. Do you have the mic? Yeah, you need to mic up, yeah. Yeah, just 1 minute, guys. Yeah, Jake.
Have
Yeah,
a
please.
clicker?
The clicker
Okay.
was, yes, here.
Oh, okay, let's see. Okay. Let me make sure this is fine. Okay. All right. Hey, everyone. I'm Jake. Today I'm going to be talking about the conditions under which encrypted key exchange is actually secure. This is work with Lance Roy and Jayushu. Okay. So like Michael said last talk, it's going to be talking about the same thing, password authenticated key exchange. We have these low entropy secrets that we want to bootstrap into a high entropy shared secret key. Okay. For the purposes of this talk, I'll go a little bit more into detail into the actual security notion. So again, Michael kind of gave some highlights of what you want to expect from a PAKE, but all I really want to point out here is that, so on the right is the UC PAKE functionality. I'm not going to expect you to read this here. I would just like you to notice that this is a little bit complicated. This is not like a standard like OT, MPC functionality. There's some subtlety into what exactly is happening in the functionality. Okay, so we have a man-in-the-middle adversary, and like was said previously, in some sense what we want to say is that the trivial online guessing attack is the best one possible. So the adversary, man in the middle of the connection, talks to one party, guesses a password, sees if it's correct. Okay, so there are game-based and UC definitions for this, and we will focus on the latter. So, okay, same thing, encrypted key exchange. This is, we're doing a key exchange, but we're just encrypting all of our messages under some password. Usually, or at least initially, this is just encryption under like an ideal cipher, but we'll see other modes of encryption as well, and this ends up kind of mattering. Okay, so this is from quite a while ago. This is from 1993. This is the first kind of PAKE paradigm that was proposed. Okay, and there's also a variant called OEKE, or one-time encrypted key exchange. Where instead of encrypting the second message, what you do is you just derive your key, and you also derive an authenticator tag to kind of check if the second message was modified or not. So this also gives you one-sided explicit authentication kind of for free. Okay. So what's the existing work on OEK and EKE? There's lots of variants. You can change what kind of key exchange you use. You can change how you're encrypting messages. You can change how you derive the key, right? Maybe you hash in the password when you derive the key. Maybe you hash the transcript in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So this kind of took a while to get going since the 90s, but by 2023, we had several proofs of UC security for sort of general OEK and EKE. So I have like an arbitrary 2-round key exchange that I'm starting with. This is some of these works. One of them uses an ideal cipher. One of them uses something called a programmable once public function, which we'll talk about later. And then there's also some recent work that uses an abstraction called a half-ideal cipher. And this is mostly just for efficiency reasons. It turns out that depending on what your key exchange is, implementing ideal cipher can sometimes be the performance bottleneck. So yeah, that's what we want to do. Okay, so we have this like table of a bunch of different like versions of this and what they start with and what they use. And again, kind of what was shown on the last talk. Unfortunately, we have a problem here. Basically, all of these constructions are insecure in some way or another. And the reasons kind of like overlap. There's several different reasons. So this actual paper ends up being quite long, sort of cataloging all these. So I will try to kind of just hit the highlights. In particular, I'm just going to, well, maybe we'll go to the next slide. So I guess the point is, can we fix this? Yes. So in this paper, we give correct UC proofs for OAKE and EKE. In a sort of general setting. And for the purposes of this talk, I will just talk about how we get a correct proof of security for EKE. OEK is a little bit different. If you want to know about that, you can find me after or ask a question or read the paper. But yeah, so we will give correct proofs in this setting, and we will use this programmable once public function as our encryption mechanism because it ends up being instantiable just in the random oracle model, and it's pretty efficient. So that's what we want to use. Okay. Okay. So part one, this POPF. What is this as an abstraction? So if I have some input-output pair, I can generate some phi so that our like this function family is indexed by phi, and so if I have my input-output pair, I can program this function once. So I can find some phi so that f phi of x equals y. And the point is, this should only be able to happen once. Once phi is determined, the other input-output behavior should appear random. And in particular, we have this kind of odd security property where if you have a weak PRF, these outputs should function as appropriate inputs for a weak PRF. So you evaluate a weak PRF, and this should also appear pseudo-random. Okay. So this paper from 2020, they introduced POPF for the purposes of making EKE more efficient. And they give a simple construction, like I said, in the random oracle model. And you should think about a POPF as like a generalization of an ideal cipher. In particular, this phi is basically an encryption of y under some like key x. But the point is, unlike an ideal cipher, there's many possible ciphertexts you could choose. And because we like weaken this, and basically this is just what we need from EKE. We don't really need that this is a permutation. And so what we get is we can weaken it a little bit and realize it a little bit more efficiently. So that's why we're doing this. So what's the problem here? So the problem here is that in this original paper, they gave a couple game-based definitions for this POPF security. And it turns out that this isn't there's a problem in the proof because this isn't actually sufficient for a man-in-the-middle setting. Basically, what happens is like a UC adversary is more flexible than in these like game-based models, and so you kind of have to end up using multiple of the game-based notions simultaneously. There's like a notion of simulation and extraction, and you have to use both basically. And so the proof doesn't actually work. Is the main point. And so the first sort of thing we have to fix here is, can we get a notion of POPF that actually works in UC? Okay. So basically, almost. This weak PRF thing that we have is a very unusual security definition because you're relying on like the security of a higher level protocol. You're like combining it and saying, oh, okay, this big thing is now secure for any weak PRF. And it turns out that if you kind of try to define a UC functionality and you say, well, I want to realize this UC functionality, you can almost get there. The simulator ends up having to guess a random oracle query, and so the simulation doesn't happen with overwhelming probability, which is what you need in the UC framework, right? So our solution to this is to relax the notion of UC realization, and we introduce a notion of almost UC realizing a functionality. Also, there's a typo here. I think this should say sometimes replace f with pi, not pi with f, okay? So what happens in almost UC? What we say is pi almost UC realizes f if you can sometimes replace this ideal functionality f with the protocol pi in a higher level protocol. And the sometimes is kind of technical, so I won't get into this here, but basically this is a restriction on the higher level simulator. So one way to kind of think about this intuitively is that if you just standard UC realize a functionality, you can always do this, right? Of course, UC composition theorem says you can do this. So basically what we're saying is like, well, we can't always kind of get the UC composition theorem, but we should be able to get it sometimes in the situations that matter to us, okay? And this ends up letting us avoid the issue because this problematic guess of a random oracle query now appears in the hybrid of our proof. And this kind of technical thing is not new. There's a really great paper from 2018 called The Wonderful World of Global Random Oracles, which talks about like the use of random oracles in UC. And they also heavily use similar techniques to this, where they can sort of, they can get away with stuff because in a hybrid you can do anything you want. Right? It's just a hybrid. Okay. So we do pay one price for this almost UC notion, which is that we get an additional factor Q security loss. Now, security loss obviously is not a great thing. We don't want this, but I do think there is a way to view this optimistically, which is that in general, in UC, if I'm replacing an ideal functionality with a protocol, again, by the UC composition theorem, the security loss is always additive. It's quite small. This is basically by definition. So you might view this as maybe a notion that can have further applicability by allowing you to instantiate things with hopefully small multiplicative security loss. Right, so okay, maybe this is like a bad thing, but also maybe this gives you the ability to get some more efficient constructions and some nice things going on. Okay, so this is basically the all we need for this like almost UC. We have this notion of POPF that we can now use in our protocol. So part two, this is an attack on some existing work. This attack is not our work. This was shown, this was given in a presentation 2 years ago by Eurocrypt. And so this attack is not our work. What will be our work is how to fix it. So in this attack, we have EKE with Diffie-Hellman, okay? And what the adversary is going to do is it's going to forward the first message just like usual. So I have an encrypted Diffie-Hellman share, adversary does nothing with it. What the adversary is going to do with the second message is when they send it back, they're going to have some password guess that they're using. They're going to decrypt the message under that password guess, and then they will square what they see and then re-encrypt it and forward it along. So if their guess is correct, you end up getting correlated keys. One key is the square of the other, right? Now, okay, there's kind of a question here. Is this actually an attack? Is this something that matters in practice? I will maybe like leave this to people whose expertise this is more than mine, because this is not something, for example, that counts as an attack in the game-based model. But what I will say is UC-PAKE really requires that if you have a key that was derived from an unattacked session, not only must this be, obviously a random high entropy key, but it has to be independent of everything else. Even if the adversary compromises everything else that happened subsequently, this key must be safe. And you can think of this as maybe a very strong version of forward security, right? So like, let's say that when the first message gets passed, the adversary doesn't actually know the password, right? Maybe it only later learns the password at the point when it sees the second message after this first key has been output, right? Maybe in this case it's a little bit more clear that what should be happening is that this first key should remain safe. This should never be able to be correlated with anything else, okay? Okay, so our fix is something that we call in the paper pseudorandom non-malleability, but this is pretty close to just the notion of pseudo-random one query CCA security for a chem. So this is like a security game where you only get one CCA query, and your messages must be pseudo-random as well. Okay, and it turns out that this is like this is actually not too hard to satisfy. For example, MLChem satisfies this. There are several other chems that satisfy this. This is not too onerous. Okay, and again, the reason for why we specifically need this property you can find in the paper. It's somewhat technical. I'll give just like one more attack that comes up in the case of EKE. This is a very, very simple attack. All the adversary is going to do is, and this applies to any underlying key exchange. This is not like a Diffie-Hellman specific attack that was like the previous one. So in this attack, all the adversary is going to do is it's going to receive the first message. It's just going to completely ignore it, throw it away, and send something absolutely random back to that first party, okay? And then, again, maybe thinking from like the forward security perspective, maybe the adversary much later learns the underlying password of that party, okay? And so the adversary can now decrypt these two messages, and the adversary sees the key exchange messages that are being used for this party to derive their key. So what does this look like? Basically, the environment will see like a real random real distribution, like a real first message of the key exchange, a random second message, and then a real key, okay? And because this adversary is just sending random garbage, in the proof, the simulator can really only set this key to random. There's nothing else that can be done. Okay, so why is this a problem? It's kind of just like a simple lemma. If you look at this, it's possible that these distributions are distinguishable even if you require standard key exchange properties. So basically all of this existing work, when they look at a general key exchange, they require three things: security, correctness, and have jointly pseudo-random messages. So the jointly pseudo-random messages is because you're using an ideal cipher. You don't want to be able to enable offline attacks, okay? And all the kind of realization is here is that you do actually have to require this property, and we give a simple counterexample in the paper that this property is not implied by standard security correctness, pseudo-randomness. Yeah, so we call this strong pseudo-randomness. We weren't able to find like a definition of this in the literature, but again, this is a simple property. I'm sure this is not the first time people have considered this situation. And maybe one final note here, this strong pseudo-randomness problem only happens when you are considering general key exchanges, in particular key exchanges where the second message depends on the first. So in the setting where you have like a one simultaneous round key exchange, this strong pseudo-randomness problem is actually not an issue at all. You do get this implication. It's specifically when you have a key exchange that is two round and not one simultaneous round. Okay, so conclusion and maybe a little bit of a personal perspective. The key takeaway for me here is that UC is very tricky, particularly these UC-PEG functionalities. And the sort of the complexity of them and the fact that you're using a man-in-the-middle adversary. This is a very strong capability. So the ePrint contains a lot more detail on sort of additional attacks and incorrect proofs in the literature. I will also recommend, my advisor wrote a kind of a simplified version of this paper that throws away some of this complicated almost UC stuff and gives a simplified exposition. I think if you're like looking to like learn more about UC-PEG or interested in what's happening here, this is a really great read. Thank you for staying to the end of the talk. I know this is the last day, second to last session, but thank you for your time.
Okay, we have time for a couple questions.
Thank you for this. It seems to me that this EEC-PRF construction seems like kind of the final boss of the possible post-quantum constructions, unless you count things in the standard model, which are generally less efficient. Do you see any possibility towards analysis of EEC-PRF in the QROM, or is the programmability just a fundamental barrier here?
This is a really good question. So to be frank, so I have not looked at existing analyses of UC PAICs in the QROM, but one thing that I'm a little bit confused about is it seems like even existing, for example, there's a lot of work even just looking at the existing random oracle model in UC. There are several versions of it. It can be like somewhat subtle. Again, I kind of mentioned this paper from 2018. So to be honest, I think there also might need to be like some foundations laid as well for stuff in combining the UC framework and the QROM. I have not attempted to prove this secure in the QROM. I would have to look at this, but I would agree like EECPRF and OEKey, to be honest, because it doesn't even have that second encryption of the message, so it's a little bit more efficient. Yeah, I would love to see an analysis of these in the QROM. I didn't mention this, but basically, because of these properties that we require, if you instantiate both these with just like regular MLChem, they're secure. MLChem satisfies these things that we say. So yeah, I would love to see that and get like maybe a strong, somewhat confident analysis of this for quantum adversaries.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's thank the speaker again. Yes. So the last talk of the session will be delivered by Matilda Backendall.
Yes, thanks. And hi, everyone. This talk is going to be about key derivation functions without salts. Actually, it's mostly going to be about another property of key derivation functions, though, which is that they're multi-input. And this is based on joint work together with my excellent co-authors, Sebastian Clement, Mark Fischlin, and Felix Günther. So what is a key derivation function? Well, it's kind of like the cryptographic analogy of a factory, which turns coal into jewelry. So a key derivation function, or KDF for short, takes as input some raw entropy. And this can, for example, be a Diffie-Hellman secret or some system entropy. And it turns it into useful cryptographic keys. Now, just like when making jewelry, we can get multiple outputs. So by providing a label and a length input to the KDF, we can get keys of different lengths and for different purposes. So how does a KDF work internally? Well, there used to be many different approaches. But ever since the seminal work of Hugo Kroschuk on HKDF from Crypto 2010, we have a very strong recipe in the form of the extract then expand paradigm. So what is this? Well, Hugo was good at making jewelry. He realized that there's a step missing here. We first have to extract the diamonds from the coal before we can turn them into earrings and necklaces. So key derivation functions work just the same in the extract and expand paradigm. We first have to extract some uniform randomness from the source key material and turn it into a pseudo-random key before we can expand it into keys of different lengths. And this is exactly how HKDF works. So what about security? Well, we need that the source key material has high enough entropy. However, this entropy doesn't have to be uniform. So for example, it can be a Diffie-Hellman secret. And we can even leak some information about the source key material. So for example, in the Diffie-Hellman case, this could be the Diffie-Hellman public keys. Now we expect that if the source key material has high enough entropy, then even if the adversary controls the label and the length inputs, then the keys output by the KDF are indistinguishable from uniform bit strings of the same length. So can we achieve this in practice? Well, yes, we can. The expand part can be instantiated with any variable output length PRF. So for example, HKDF expand is just HMAC iterated until we get a key output of the desired length. And the extract step can be instantiated with any cryptographic extractor. But there's actually one part here that I didn't mention yet, and that's that extractor theory says that in order to extract uniform entropy or randomness from arbitrary sources of source key material, the extractor needs a salt. And this can't just be any old table salt, it has to be a special salt. So the fine print here says that the salt has to be random and independent from the source key material. However, it doesn't have to be secret, so in particular, it's fine if the adversary learns the salt. Unfortunately, this special type of salt is hard to come by, so what most protocols do in practice is just skip it. And this leads to a gap between the theory of key derivation functions and how they are constructed in the real world. So we have a practical problem. People in practice don't have salts. So what most protocols do is just substitute it with a 0 string. Now, this is fine if you're willing to assume the random oracle model. However, there's a more important problem, and that's that the syntax of KDFs only support a single source key material input. But in practice, protocols actually need to combine several inputs. So where does this need arise? Well, there are two main reasons. The first is to combine keys. So, for example, some of the source key material might not have high enough entropy, or it might be compromised by the adversary. So if you think about a key exchange protocol like Signal, for example, we have a very strong threat model where the adversary is assumed to be able to compromise some of the keys in the protocol. So in this case, we would really like a KDF that's able to combine multiple source key material inputs such that the derived key is still secure as long as at least one of the inputs has high enough entropy. The second use case is to combine sources. So all source key material is generated by some source, but not all sources might be secure. So for example, if one of the sources is Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and we have a quantum adversary which can break the discrete log. In this case, we would like that the KDF can combine key material from different sources such that the output key is secure, as long as at least one of the underlying cryptographic assumptions is not broken. So in this case, for example, we might want to combine the Diffie-Hellman source with keys from a post-quantum secure chem. And this type of KDF is often referred to as a hybrid. So you can think back to Michael's talk, for example, about hybrid PAKes. All right, so key combiners are prominent. They show up everywhere in our cryptographic protocols. So for example, TLS 1.3 combines a pre-shared key with a Diffie-Hellman ephemeral. MLS combines an arbitrary number of pre-shared keys. And Signal X3DH combines 3 to 4 Diffie-Hellman ephemerals. And key combiners to combine sources are used increasingly to hedge against the threat of quantum adversaries. So mostly by combining post-quantum secure sources with classical ones, but in the future potentially also to achieve information theoretic security by combining the keys from a quantum key distribution protocol with computationally secure ones. So how do these constructions work, given that the current syntax for KDFs only support a single input? Well, let's take a look at some of the strategies used in practice. So the first strategy is to use the salt input. So remember that the extractor takes as input a salt, but I said that in practice no one uses salt. So what some of these protocols thought is, let's just put the second key material input there. So this is what TLS 1.3 does, for example. In TLS 1.3, we want to combine a pre-shared key with the Diffie-Hellman ephemeral. So to do this, TLS puts the pre-shared key through HKDF extract using a 0 salt. And this will result in a potentially good key if the pre-shared key has high enough entropy. Then we want to combine this potentially good key with the Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, and to do this, we put that into the salt input of HKDF extract. Okay, MLS uses a very similar strategy, except that, to extract from their pre-shared keys, except that they first put every pre-shared key through HKDF using a 0 salt, and then they layer calls to HKDF extract, where the output key from the previous layer is put into the salt input of HKDF until all of the pre-shared keys have been absorbed. Signal instead uses a more straightforward strategy in order to get a single input for HKDF. Namely, they just concatenate the 3 to 4 Diffie-Hellman ephemerals and use a 0 salt. So both the TLS, MLS, and Signal constructions have been analyzed inside their respective protocols, but the underlying strategies for constructing a key combiner, namely to use the salt input or to concatenate the source key material inputs, have not been analyzed because we didn't have a security notion for multi-input key derivation functions. In particular, without such a security notion, we were unable to ask if there are other potentially better approaches out there for constructing key combiners. So that's what we set out to change. In this work, we provide a new syntax for key derivation functions that support multiple inputs of source key material, but take no salts. Okay, so let's walk through our new syntax, starting with the syntax of a single input KDF. So recall that classically, a KDF takes a single source key material input from a designated source, a salt, a label, and a length. Now, as I said, the first change that we make is to drop the salt input. And our motivation here is that salts are almost never used in practice, so they don't contribute to the practical security of KDFs. Moreover, they're often misused, and this sometimes even leads to insecure constructions, as I'll show you later. So instead, we changed the input syntax to support multiple source key material inputs from every source. Now, importantly, these inputs can be correlated. So for example, if the source is Diffie-Hellman key exchange, these inputs could be the Diffie-Hellman secrets resulting from pairwise combination of a set of Diffie-Hellman public keys. Now, this correlation is a novel aspect of multi-input KDFs, so we accordingly update our definition of a source to generate a vector of potentially correlated key material with each sample. Our next change to the syntax is to introduce a new input type called context. So this context is meant to provide some information about the source key material. So again, in the Diffie-Hellman example, this could be the Diffie-Hellman public keys, as well as the group generator and group order, for example. Now, I'll note that in the single input KDF syntax, the label was sometimes referred to as context and also used to provide information about the source key material. But this ambiguity puts a lot of burden on the user of the KDF to know which information to put where. So in our new syntax, we instead designate the label to be the place to put information about the derived key. So for this reason, there's one label per key derivation, but one context per source key material input. The final change we make to the syntax of multi-input KDFs is to support multiple sources. And we want to do this in order to be able to cover real-world constructions that combine different types of key materials. So for example, in this case, a second source could generate uniform or pseudorandom keys. And in this case, the inputs themselves might not be correlated, but we will still sample them as a vector. Also, the context here might be empty, or it might contain some key identifier. Okay, so in total then we have some number n of inputs to the KDF, consisting of source key material, which we call sigma, and context c. And we will call a KDF which takes n inputs an n KDF. And these n inputs are generated by some number r of sources, and r here might be smaller than n, but we assume that there's a function associated to the n KDF, which maps each source to some subset of the n input positions. All right, so what about security? Well, just like in single input KDF security, we let the adversary control the label and the length input. Additionally, the adversary can set source key material inputs, as long as at least one of these inputs remains honest. However, we still allow some leakage about this honest input, which at the minimum includes the context. Now, just like for single KDFs, the goal of the adversary is still to distinguish the output keys from uniformly random bit strings of the same length. So with this amount of adversarial control and leakage, we actually get a very strong security notion, which caters to the maximum exposure threat model of key exchange protocols. In our security game, the amount of adversarial influence is actually controlled through a parameter, which we call the requirement. So in this case, for key combiners, the requirement is that we have at least one honest source key material input. Now, having this be a parameter allows us to flexibly change this around to cater to different security settings. So for example, by changing the requirement parameters, we can also cover the hybrid security setting where we want to combine sources instead. So here, the requirement of the adversary is no longer that there's a single honest source key material input, but that there is at least one source from which all source key material inputs are honest. Now, we still allow leakage as before. Okay, so with these parameters, we're actually able to cover quite a few different settings, including extendable output functions and more. But I also want to mention that we have an entirely separate security notion, which covers collision resistance of NKDFs. So here, the adversary gets to provide two sets of inputs to the KDF, including label and length, and these have to differ in at least one position. And if they do, the adversary wins if it can produce two output keys that collide. Okay, so armed with our new security notions and syntax, we analyzed a bunch of real-world constructions. So first of all, we looked at MLS, which, as you'll recall, uses the chaining strategy for their pseudorandom pre-shared key, combiner. And we showed that this is secure as long as the pre-shared keys are assumed to be pseudorandom, HMAC is a dual PRF, and collision resistant. Then we looked at signal X3DH, which uses the concatenation strategy, and we showed that this is also secure in the random oracle model if the Diffie-Hellman secrets are assumed to be unpredictable. We then analyzed a generic hash-based construction, which works kind of similarly to the signal one, except that instead of direct concatenation of the input key materials, it uses some unambiguous encoding. Now, we showed that this kind of construction is also secure if the source key material is unpredictable and you model the hash function as a random oracle. Finally, we looked at another proposal for a concatenation-based KDF by the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, ETSI, and we call this KDF ETSI-CAT KDF. And we were able to show that this KDF is generically insecure as an NKDF. So let's take a look at how ETSI does things. So just to recall, this is what signal looks like, concatenating the Diffie-Hellman inputs. Now, ETSI does something very similar. They just concatenate all of the arbitrarily number of keys, where these keys come from some sort of key exchange protocol. Now, in contrast to Signal, though, ETSI doesn't use this zero salt. Instead, they put the label into the salt input of HKDF extract. Now, this leads to problems with security, because in HKDF, the salts are padded with zeros up to a fixed length. But recall that in the security game, the adversary controls the label. So the adversary can just input or create two different labels that differ only in a suffix, where one ends with zeros, and this will lead to a collision in the output keys, giving it a trivial distinguishing case. Okay, so ETSI-CAT KDF is generically insecure as an NKDF, but we're able to show that it is secure if you fix the label and length, the length of the labels and the keys. All right, so now that we have a security notion for multi-input KDFs, we can also ask how to make new constructions. Towards this, we first propose a generic pattern, which we call the combine and expand paradigm. And this is, of course, inspired by the extract and expand paradigm of Krasik. So the difference here is that we replace the extractor with a combiner, which combines the multiple source key material inputs and doesn't take a salt. Now, we think that this is a helpful paradigm, because a combiner is a much simpler object to construct than a full NKDF. In particular, it only has to give a single fixed length pseudorandom key as output. And for the expand step, we can reuse existing constructions, such as HKDF expand. All right, beyond this generic paradigm, we also propose two concrete new multi-input KDF constructions. So the first is a 2KDF based entirely on block ciphers, and the second is a source combiner, which achieves information theoretic security as long as one of the sources is assumed to be information theoretically secure. Now, I'm in the key exchange session, so of course we also had to look at some applications. So the final thing we did is to look at our NKDF notion and show that it suffices to achieve passively secure key exchange security in a simple key exchange protocol, which uses a chem plus chem combiner. Okay, this brings me to the end of my talk. In this talk, we introduced a new syntax for multi-input key derivation functions without salts. We also defined several security notions, including key combiners, hybrids, and collision resistance. And then we proposed a combine and expand paradigm for constructing new multi-input key derivation functions. We also analyzed a bunch of real-world constructions, including Signal, MLS, and ETSI-CAT KDF, as well as proposed two concrete new constructions based on block ciphers and for information theoretic security. And finally, we showed that we can achieve passively secure key exchange using multi-input KDFs. Now, in terms of future work, I think there's actually a lot of open, interesting questions here. So, of course, there's still a multitude of real-world constructions out there to be analyzed. But I think the main work that we have is actually constructing a good multi-input key derivation function that we can standardize, because so far we have no such construction out there. Our framework with the flexible requirement parameter also allows us to create many different security notions. So if there are targeted settings out there that require different security notions, I think there's work left to be done on those definitions as well. So if you found any of this interesting, I highly recommend checking out the details of our paper, which is on ePrint. And with that, I want to say thank you for listening.
Do you have questions?
For your results in the random oracle models, how do you define entropy relative to a random oracle?
Sorry?
How do you define entropies as a source has entropy relative to a random oracle? Do you allow the sources that could depend on the random oracle?
No, I think the sources have to be independent from the random oracle, but this I'll have to look up actually. Maybe we can take it offline. Yeah.
Oh, I see. And maybe, well, a related question for you, results, I guess even in the standard model, if the only thing about the source you assume is entropy, right? Or do you assume pseudorandomness? Because you have some standard model results?
We have some standard model results for the sources where we can assume pseudorandom keys. Yeah, so for the pre-shared keys example, for example.
Because
Yeah.
otherwise extractors, in general, impossible results are solved, so I guess you just assume the sources.
Exactly, yeah. No, so these are for specific constructions like the MLS pre-shared key combiner, where we do assume that the pre-shared keys are already pseudorandom. But otherwise, you're right, yeah, because we got rid of the salts, we're sort of stuck in the random oracle model.
Let's use my paper.
Yes, absolutely. Look at Yev's paper on seedless PRGs, right?
Could you say more about your the source combiner that you constructed? And I think it'd be interesting if we could come up with some examples using like HMAC and Ketchik and just like have options, maybe to standardize, like you say.
So are you wondering about a specific source combiner, like the information theoretic secure one?
Yeah,
or?
that one.
So that one uses, if I recall correctly, it's like generic, but uses an XOR. So basically, like you take the source key material that's assumed to come from the information theoretically secure source and basically XOR it into the result of a generic 2 KDF. Because then you already have the like normal KDF security property coming from the 2 KDF, and then if you additionally XOR it with the information theoretically secure sample, you can get information theoretic security. So it doesn't talk about any particular underlying primitives like HMAC or so on. It's meant to be more generic.
Thank you.
Hi, Matilda. Thank you for the excellent talk. You had a slide where you have your security interface, and you had like what could be violated by the adversary and what it couldn't. So they could set the label, and they could get a bunch of the keys, and they could leak the context you mentioned.
Yeah.
For one of the target, I guess the last good key, so to say. But I was wondering because at the very beginning you had a different slide where instead you were looking at G to the AB, and then you were saying, oh look, the adversary may also have some leakage, which I guess is what informs the choice of leaking the context to the adversary. I was wondering if the dual statement is true, that you should put all the leakage in the context specifically. Like, is there also like a purpose from the point of view of the construction to put your leakage in the context?
So I think the reason that we made a separation between leakage and context is that we think that there are settings where the leakage might not be well defined or like even possible to write down. So if you think about system entropy, for example, it might just not be sort of encodable as context that could be used in the key derivation. That was the reason that we split these two, but we wanted to make it explicit that the leakage will always contain all of the context. So if there is sort of context which can be used for the key derivation, then this would also count as leakage, but not the other way around.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick one, please. Yeah, go ahead.
I very much appreciate how your team's research not only breaks systems, but also produces novel constructions that are interesting. That's great. My question is, regarding etccat KDF, you mentioned that in your model, the adversary controls the label. Yep. But did you find that to be the case in practice?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it really depends on the setting for where you would use a multi-input KDF. Now, I'm not super familiar with all the internals of the different key exchange protocols that we analyze, but I think there are definitely settings where we want to have this property. I mean, at least you can think of it as being something stronger, you know, like we use in CPA, right? So we always want to give the adversary as much control as possible. And I think the label is definitely not a place where we assume that we get entropy as input, so it makes sense to allow the adversary to control this.
Okay, yeah, let's thank all the speakers of the session again.